I think when you look back on the memory of the things that you've accomplished and experienced in your life, I think it's hard to nail down any one moment. Even more so as time gradually goes on, remembering moments with great detail becomes extremely difficult, but the ones that meant the most are always easy to see very clearly. I spent 24 years in the military, and I don't really think there's any one particular moment that I can settle on as being one that stands out the most, because there were thousands. And it's a culmination of many moments in your life that kind of make up who you are and have molded who you are becoming. And I think it's something to think about. Have you ever looked back in your life and wondered where all that time went? I got to tell you, it happens to all of us. And thinking back to all the things that I've done in my life, there are just so many moments in your life that have way more meaning than others. Now, that goes without saying. Of course, there's momentous occasions and things that you put in your little mental scrapbooks. But, if you were to put your life down on paper, what would that look like? And so I asked that question because when you look back and you say to yourself, where did the time go? You're not alone. It happens to all of us. Welcome to All In, Always, the podcast where service, sacrifice, and leadership are more than stories. They're a way of life. I'm Chris Garcia, and every episode we take a look behind the uniform to share the experiences, the lessons, and moments that shaped a lifetime of service. Whether you're a veteran, a first responder, currently serving, a family member, or somebody who just wants to better understand this life, I'm glad you're here. If these conversations mean something to you, follow the podcast, subscribe on YouTube, and share this episode with somebody who would appreciate hearing it. Now, let's get into today's story. Between 2005 and 2011, I deployed 3 more times. We were still flying over Iraq. We were spending a lot more time over Somalia. The Arabian Gulf, which used to be called the Persian Gulf. I flew over the Pacific, Central America, and I even got an opportunity to train dozens of new flight engineers coming through the pipeline. And then, ultimately, during those 6 years, probably a culmination of all those things that I was doing in the progression of my career, moved me into the next chapter of my life, which was becoming a chief petty officer. And before I knew it, I wasn't just another flight engineer anymore. I was becoming a leader. So in retrospect, you reach back into those memory banks, and I think to myself, those 6 years went by faster than any other period in my Navy career. And I wish it didn't feel that way. Because there are points in that 6 years that I think molded me into a different person. One of those, the time before and the time after. So by late 2004, I was packing another sea bag. VP5 was deploying again, and this time we were headed to Africa. And not just any part of Africa. Our destination was Djibouti. Djibouti was in between Ethiopia and Somalia, also known as the Horn of Africa. So what a lot of people don't understand is, when they use the term Africa hot, most of the time, unless you've been there, I know it's a figure of speech, but you just don't get it. So just continue to say hotter than Georgia asphalt, because at least you could get away with saying, hey, I know what that feels like. But some of us, we get to actually truthfully talk about how hot Africa really is, especially in a place called Djibouti. I mean, come on. Why wouldn't it be hot in Djibouti? Well, it's not just the heat. The one thing that I remember the most when I first got off the airplane is there's this pungent smell in the air just floating there. It is residual from the night before. Because every night the burn pits were going. And that's what I think I remember, probably not the most, but more than other things that were happening there. Definitely that was one of them. It was the most hateful thing you could do to a bunch of human beings living in that kind of condition, in that kind of heat, and not even think twice about it. But the smell and the dust, the combination of everything. I remember walking out of my container living unit, we called a clue, right? We're all about acronyms. But it was just, and that's exactly what you would believe it to be. I mean, if you're not familiar with it, a container living unit is a shipping container. Same ones you've seen on the cargo ships floating in the ocean, the same ones you see traveling down the highway. Not ideal, but when you're in the military, not a whole lot of your living conditions are ideal. And to be honest with you, in the P3 community, we did a lot of staying in hotels just because we weren't shipboard. There was no such thing as really a port call, because everywhere we would go was basically a port that we would stay in for long periods of time. And if we weren't held up in some kind of barracks that had, somewhat standard amenities for personnel, we were away on detachments, staying in some pretty good hotels. So I can't really complain too much when I say, hey, I had to, stay in a hooch in Kuwait, or I had to stay in a container in Djibouti, because I know that I had it easy compared to a lot of people that were serving and still are serving. So there will always be those who have to adapt a little bit harder than others. But there's definitely a contrast between what I was about to experience on this particular deployment as opposed to the deployments I had in the past, right? It's definitely not anything like Iceland. It's nothing like Europe, and not even close to the area around the Caribbean. So anti-piracy was one of the things that we did the most, and it was becoming very prevalent. And, let me switch gears for a second. First off, the history of piracy goes way, way far back, long before we had airplanes and long before we had a military that could support the mission. All right. But as times change, so do tactics, so does the way that they operate. Right. So, we're talking about modern times now, and they were getting pretty savvy. Everybody's seen Captain Phillips. Everybody saw the footage about the Maersk, Alabama. So everybody's familiar with shipping lanes being under attack from pirates. And these days, it's all about shipping lanes. It's all about commerce. It's all about national security. All those things rolled up together. It's a NATO mission, and it's something that you do with your neighbors and your host countries that are in the area. But flying over the ocean is very calming. And until you're actually doing something that matters, like you're on top of a dhow. A dhow is, if you're not familiar, it's a ship. It's a larger ship. It's the new and improved, fast moving pirate ships. I mean, they build those things in their port in Somalia like we mass produce automobiles. So you just think about that. I mean, it's constantly happening. It's happening a lot more than you even know about. Most people have even forgotten that this mission existed, but it's still happening. It's not like they're going to stop going out and trying to hijack tankers and what have you, right? Because as long as these companies are willing to pay the ransoms to get the crew free and get that boat back as quickly as possible, they're just going to continue to do it. So in order to thwart those efforts, obviously we're down there and we're making passes. We're looking out for bad guys, and then we're directing our friendlies in to intercept them. In some cases, I wouldn't say I was lucky enough, but I did have the experience to watch some of these things go down to where we're sending H-60s over with a complement of combat crewmen that are ready to do God's work, right? And to get these pirates away from these ships or off the ships if they have overrun the crew and they've actually become successful in taking it over. So if you haven't seen Captain Phillips, you can probably get a little touch on what happens in those situations. It isn't always about action pack, bang, bang type of thing. A lot of times, you're just there to point people in the right direction, give them a heads up. And then hopefully the crew themselves, because we can't be everywhere at once. The ocean is vast, and we try to get to them as quickly as possible and get others to them that can actually do some help, considering that we can only fly in circles around them. We do our best to make sure that we're mitigating the risk. They do have trained crew who are on board. They carry what I would call mercenaries and security support on these tankers and these cargo ships to prevent that from happening. But that's only a deterrent. But I've seen some pretty interesting things take place under my watch, sitting there in the flight station of the P3. And then we were there probably 3 months, and we shifted, which I absolutely loved, being able to transition from one place to another, especially when you're stuck in a shithole like Djibouti. You don't want to be there forever, right? So you limit your exposure, not just to the environment, but also the burn pits. So where was I going next? Bahrain. Now, Bahrain is a sight different from Djibouti. Our living conditions were upgraded. We ended up getting a little house right off base. I think it had like 5 or 6 bedrooms. Everybody was sharing a bedroom, but it was literally a house. Had a kitchen. I mean, it was full complement of everything that you needed without having to stick a bunch of people into the barracks. But they didn't have any room for us on the base in Bahrain. So that's where we stayed, and we took care of all our business on the base, whatever mission, briefings, debriefings, and haircuts. You got to go somewhere, right? Lower them ears, get a little bit of high-speed, low drag for your head. But other than that, the day-to-day was one of two things. You're either going to go flying in the Arabian Gulf and do kind of the same missions, or you were going to fly up north and you were going to get into Iraq and fly some of the missions that I talked about in my last podcast. And when you weren't flying, then you were enjoying the absolutely ridiculous heat of Bahrain, probably just as bad as Djibouti. We didn't have to deal with any weird smells other than what was coming out of maybe some of the restaurants there. Believe it or not, some of the best food I've had comes from that part of the world. So you can't knock it. It's definitely busier. We spent some time on the Kingdom Airport, I think they call it, right? Sometimes we would have to leave because for whatever reason, we were trying to keep our airplanes out of sight of the king when he would come into town. I don't even know why the king wasn't always in town anyway. Maybe it was just the fact that he would fly into there and they didn't want him to have to see our gaggle of aircraft on the other side of his beautiful airport. So, but yes, aircraft were launching every day. Some were going into the Arabian Gulf to monitor traffic, and others were going north to continue the mission, continue Iraqi freedom, although we've already called that a success at that point. We were just still kind of monitoring what was going on with the insurgencies and with ISIS. So everything kind of stays the same. Long transit flights on those missions. We're supporting troops without ever setting foot on the battlefield. And then my personal observation is this. Most people think that war only happens where the fighting is, but there's an enormous machine behind every operation, and we're just a small part of that machine. A lot of times I felt like what we were doing probably at the low point, right? So we've already said, hey, Operation Iraqi Freedom is a success. George W. Bush came on to the aircraft carrier. It was a big deal, right? But Osama bin Laden was still out there. The Taliban was still out there. Those terror threats were out there. ISIS was just becoming something. And, of course, things were changing. But there isn't always a mission to be had that's kind of war-oriented, even though you're over in that area of the world. So once again, you're flying in between the Arabian Gulf, dealing with the Iranians always wanting to check you out. And back then, it was always tense. I remember we were out flying the Arabian Gulf one time and minding our own business. There's standoff there that we're supposed to honor from every single country that we fly off the coast of, right? So, beyond 12 miles is usually standard standoff because it's international water. Sometimes it extends beyond that. You have to push out even further. And then you want to just, for a little bit of buffer, add a couple of nautical miles to that. So we were well within our right to be flying where we were flying. Well, in this case, we were just flying along. We'd been flying in this area off the coast of Iran for a couple hours. And finally, the IFT is sitting in the observer room window in the back is supposed to be making call outs for ships or taking pictures or dropping sonar buoys, which in that case, we weren't searching for submarines. So there was nothing for him to really do except look out the window or fix equipment. But in this case, he'd been sitting in that seat because that's his station and that's where he sits normally for a couple, 2-3 hours. You know, he started there on takeoff. He was there through transit, and he was there a couple hours on station. And he finally comes up over the radio and he says, "You guys see that P3, right?" And we're like, "What? Where?" "Oh, yeah, it's just off our left wing here, off our port side." And I get out of the seat and I look through the little photo window that's behind the pilot seat. And sure enough, there it was. And you could see it out of the pilot side window screen too. A big, beautiful blue and gray camouflage Iranian P3. And they were so close, we could see the crew inside the flight station and everybody that was looking at us. Well, they aren't friendly. And they came up on us without any notification, right? It's like, let's change lanes without our blinker type of thing. So obviously it was more adversarial, right? They're puffing out their chest or they're flexing, however you want to say it these days. But that's pretty much what they were doing. But of course, we're not getting intimidated. You know, we stayed on our line. We stayed on our track. We continued to do the mission like they were not there. And you know what? They got bored with us and then they took off. And we never saw them again. Even after we continued to do that mission, we were fully expecting to see them come back and kind of be our shadow, is what we call it. But it didn't happen. I think if you show these people that it bothers you, they tend to kind of double down. So that's why you just got to look the other way, continue what you're doing, turn the other cheek, so to speak, and get shit done. So at the end of that deployment, it was time for me to leave. Prior to that deployment, I was able to become a flight engineer instructor. So I was training new flight engineers who came to the command and to get them fully qualified. So during that time, I did have what we call a nugget and flew with that individual for a certain amount of time before he was able to take the reins on his own. And then it was time for deployment to end and time for me to change the direction I was headed. So 3 great deployments under my belt by that time, and it was time to transition to another squadron. Now, I probably could have stayed in the same place, but I had bigger plans. I had already become an instructor at the squadron, which basically consisted of me taking on an unqualified flight engineer who had just gotten out of the school and get them qualified and trained in order to be able to operate the aircraft safely on their own. But what I was looking to do next was to go a little bit further than that. I wanted to be more involved, and the place that we were able to do that was actually right next door to where I was currently, which was VP 30, just another hangar over in the same area in Jacksonville. So I thought, hey, deployment ends, let me get a little breathing room. But you know what they say, best laid plans. And the Navy definitely had other plans for me. Now, as a flight engineer, we're pretty lucky because we are a small group and because it's a small world. And the Navy itself, by all intents and purposes, is small in of its own. The flight engineer group is like a little association. And it gets to the point where it's so small that pretty soon everybody knows everybody if you're in it long enough. So I requested instructor school. I wanted to stick around. I had lived in the area for ever since I showed up to go to the school originally anyway. And my plan for the future was, and for my kids, was not to have to move them around. So if I had an opportunity to stay in the same place and not uproot everybody every 3 or 4 years, I was trying to do that. So this was one way in order to make that happen. And luckily, because you're in such a small group of folks who are that close and can help you out in that way, it's usually easy to get what you're asking for. So in this case, that was instructor school. At this point, I had never taught adults before. I've always been the learner. I do like to get up and take charge of situations. That's kind of a natural thing for me. I enjoy speaking in large groups, even though it intimidates me every single time I do it. But once I get going, I feel at home. So public speaking, even if I can't even say the word, public speaking, not really a huge issue. I just need to learn a few extra things that the Navy requires you to do in order to become a full-fledged classroom instructor, as well as being a practical, hands-on instructor. Definitely diving a little bit deeper. They want to know what you know, and they want to make sure you're not going to be teaching the wrong things. And I think one of the biggest takeaways I learned from going to instructor school was the laws of learning, right? And the one thing that I remember the most from the laws of learning, as it was taught to me, is primacy. Primacy is everything when you're teaching somebody who has no idea, no baseline. When you teach somebody from the ground up, it's got to be spot on. So the emphasis is always, number one, understand the learner, understand who your audience is and how well they learn and what type of learner they are, because you might have to shift gears in order to get somebody to understand what you're trying to convey. It is a difficult process for some, but if you're able to identify where the gaps are when somebody's trying to learn something, then you can adjust specifically for that person and tailor how you teach to each individual. And not to a point where you're taking all the time to give somebody special treatment, but to at least speak at a level or to teach it at a level where the message can be conveyed to everybody without going over the head of anyone and without making anybody feel like you're insulting their intelligence. So it takes a true understanding of how that all works and how that all comes into play. So instructor school definitely did help. And, it was only maybe 2 or 3 weeks long. It wasn't that long. And then you're fed to the wolves, so to speak. So my experience, as I remember it, is the Journeyman Instructor Training School that was in Kings Bay, Georgia. Good stuff. You get to the squadron, you check in, and now that's when it's almost like you're getting qualified all over again. If there's one thing that I did a lot of during my time in the military was boards, whether it be sitting on a board and questioning somebody on the other side of the table or vice versa. But I definitely had my share of time standing up at that whiteboard, trying to show my skills and convey the message to where somebody could understand me if I was teaching in front of a class. So there was a lot of rib rubbing, right? So elbowing and, like I said earlier in the series, we're talking about as flight engineers, like lions like to eat their young, I think is the saying, but it's true and it's for good reason. And I explained all that before, but I'll say it again, especially when it comes to teaching, is coming through as somebody who wants to be an instructor, somebody who wants to be the best of the best, to be able to go out and train not just students coming into the fleet, but instructors who are out in the fleet like I was, to get an opportunity to go through a crash course in how to properly train students. So that was also one of the things that we learned how to do. Once you got qualified as an instructor, it wasn't over after that. So you would learn the classroom environment. The initial school would teach you that. And it helps you develop patience while you are instructing. Because if you don't have patience, then you're not going to be able to teach anybody anything. Because I know I was slow. And so when you're done learning the basics of being an instructor and you get to the fleet replacement squadron is what it's called, then you're up against guys who have been doing it for decades or more, right? You got the old school guys, you got the new school guys, you got guys who just got qualified, but every one of them had to go through the process. And part of that process is you're going to stand up in front of your peers and you're going to pretend to teach a class. They are going to be the worst of the worst students, and you have to try to get them in line. And at the same time, you are displaying your knowledge and your skill to be able to convey that knowledge if it's correct. So not only are you doing a board that is measuring the amount of knowledge that you have personally to teach, but it's also evaluating your ability to run a classroom. So very, very difficult process. Some guys took more than once to get through it. I got through it pretty easy, I would say. If memory serves, I only had to do it once, but then it's not over after that. There's other things that you have to do. You get into the flight station. There's simulators. It's almost like you're going through flight engineer school all over again. But this is at a level that's well beyond that, because not only do you have to use the knowledge that you've already gained from becoming a full-fledged flight engineer, but you're also utilizing the instructor prowess that you have come to adopt to be able to teach that knowledge and at a level that's above where it was when you were just a standard flight engineer. So that includes going into simulators and actually getting into the flight station with your peers, once again, who are pretending to be students. And the most difficult process is to be safe, because that's what they're trying to get you to do. They know your knowledge is there. They know you can teach a classroom, but now you get to a point where like, hey, what happens if they push the wrong button, or if they shut down the wrong engine, or they got two engines shut down and they happen to be both on the same side? What are you going to do? And there's certain processes and procedures that you have to follow when those things happen. And so a lot of the times it's batting hands out of the way, or it's, pulling up a student out of the seat, making sure they're okay, and then getting in the seat and restarting these engines and, unscrewing what's been screwed up, so to speak. But first and foremost, you want to prevent that from happening to begin with. Those are worst case scenarios, and we know it doesn't happen all the time, but we teach for worst case. So learned a lot there. And then you get an opportunity beyond that to be able to go into the fleet, and we call a fleet instructor under training course, which is given at the fleet level. We go to the squadrons and we travel and we meet up with their prospective instructors, and we put them through that process. We put them through hey, I'm going to play student. And God, I tell you what, that was super fun to do. We'd all have these funny names that we'd make up on our name tags, and we put them on our flight suits, and we take on this different persona. I mean, it was all acting, but for purpose. But that was one of the things that I think I remember the most. I did have fun with it. I did get a lot out of it. The experience that I gained teaching others in that way was something that, I'll have with me forever. Obviously, you can see how I'm talking about it. So it did mean something to me. But, you go back to those classrooms with those actual students, then things change. It's just like when you become qualified in anything that you do. You don't know how to do it in the beginning. You're learning how to do it. You finally get good at it. And all of a sudden, there's nobody over your shoulder telling you whether or not what you're about to do or what you did is right, wrong, or indifferent. You're on your own. So kind of the same scenario. And you would take a student out and you would do the practical stuff, which is in a really like no shit scenario where you've got a pilot in the right seat about to do a takeoff, or maybe he's the left seat. I don't remember in what order it happened in, but I will tell you this. 2 people of the 3 that were sitting in seats that could make a difference on whether that airplane stayed in the air had never flown in an airplane before. And actually, I'll go back for a second. That's not a true statement, because the pilot that's sitting there about to take off has not necessarily not had the experience of flying. They just haven't had the experience of flying in that aircraft. Now, the pilots get an opportunity prior to making it to their platform, which in this case would be a P3, to operate and fly aircraft prior to that. So they've flown before, but nothing of this scale, right? Because they have to learn somewhere. So you're talking about two of the three individuals sitting in those seats that matter have never been actually in this aircraft and operating it. And if you think about it, pilots in the real world, in the commercial world, same thing. Hours and hours of simulation. And in some cases, and don't let this scare you if you're a civilian and you didn't know this, but one of those pilots at some point in your flying experience as a passenger on an airliner, your co-pilot probably had never actually flown that plane in his entire life. Captain's been there for a while. He's got tenure. He's probably been flying that same style aircraft, that same platform for hundreds of thousands of hours. And then he gets this guy in the seat that's got thousands of hours in a simulator and never in the 737 that he's about to take off into the air. So think about that. But it's kind of the same idea. How else are they going to get experience? Sure, they had some single engine, maybe some dual engine training, prop jobs mostly. But to make a long story longer, basically, you got to make sure that whatever's about to happen, that could happen, doesn't happen on your watch. Now, not too many incidences out there that I can recall, even to this day, have resulted in a fatal accident by a P-3 crashing during a training mission or a training flight. And if it has happened, it hasn't happened in decades. So there's that. But, there's always the opportunity. So that's what they teach you as an instructor, as somebody standing behind the guy that you're teaching. You have to be ready for everything. And so if you got to fling a student out of the seat to get your hot little ass in there to start up some engines and run some checklists and keep the airplane in the air, then that's what you got to do, and that's what you get trained for. So every new flight engineer in a P3 community, they eventually come through those classrooms. And I had the privilege and the honor to be able to train quite a few of them. And maybe some of them are still out there, hopefully. So I spent 3 years at VP30, and every one of them very rewarding. Being able to see those nervous students come through in the beginning and leave and graduate there at the end as confident, competent air crewmen. They weren't 100% ready to go out and do it on their own, but we were ready and we felt confident in what we've done and in their ability to be able to go to their next squadron and really show them what they learned. But at the end of the day, I think I learned more as an instructor than as a student. Considering all the training, sure, that seemed pretty evident, but I think there's a lot of other lessons I learned outside of my knowledge increasing about the aircraft. Obviously, there was so many things I didn't know that I wasn't teaching before I got there that I still remember to this day. And I think there's some places in your brain where stuff gets unlocked. I think everybody can be taught something. And I think that if you struggle quite a bit learning a particular subject, I think there's a point where you could probably even say to this day, if you look back on it, that there was some point that it just clicked for you. It was like butter, but all you could remember in the beginning was complication. I can't figure it out. Just butting your head up against the wall until that day, everybody's got that switch. And I like nothing more than to see that switch turn on and that light bulb come on in a student when they finally get it. So 3 years ends 2008 in the fall, right around October. I end up getting orders back to good old VP5 and the Mad Foxes. Familiar ground, familiar people, a lot of us, and a lot of the guys that I made friends with while I was at VP30 as an instructor, they were already there, and it made it a lot easier to transition back to a place that I was before, even more so than the fact that I had been there just 3 years prior. So felt like home again. But then no sooner do you unpack that you're back out flying overseas again. So we got our deployment orders. December 2008, we were headed to Okinawa, Kadena Air Base. And I didn't spend as much time as I would have liked to have spent. While I was in Okinawa, I did get an opportunity to go out. I think a day, maybe a couple days out of the time that I spent there. And I was there quite a while. The good thing about Air Force bases like in Kadena is that there's enough there to keep you occupied without ever having to leave the base. And that's what's great about the Air Force. They really know how to take care of their people, and the Navy was part of that. But the people were great. They were all very little. You can always tell an American walking amongst a bunch of Japanese people because I swear they only make them about 5 feet tall. But from time to time, you would see a tall Japanese person and you'd be like, whoa, are you 100% Japanese? But food's great. There's probably one place that I experienced that the guys took me to that's familiar to everybody. And I saw some things that I probably shouldn't have seen, or it's not a matter of I shouldn't have seen them. I think it was more of a matter of like, I wouldn't go back to see it again. Let's put it that way. So you got to have that experience though. In any case, there wasn't much else that I could think of having gone on there that I would say, hey, you know what? I love Okinawa. And don't get me wrong, it's beautiful. I've flown around it. I've driven around it. I've walked around it. It's just not mainland Japan. And that's a place that I think I'd like to go and see. But it's a beautiful island. The mission there, a lot different than what I was doing up to that point. And honestly, it was probably some of the most boring missions I had ever done. I was never a big fan of flying over the water, doing nothing. I love the surveillance side of the patrol and reconnaissance side of VP life. But flying over the water for hours on end, just endless blue, it's not my cup of tea. I'm all about supporting the mission out there, and especially out there with the Japanese. We did some things with them. Hawaii and Guam, or either direction, you can get to those. I believe I went to Guam during that time. I think I was taking some parts because somebody was broke down there, but that I didn't see much of Guam that time around. But halfway through our deployment in Japan, once again, I'm going someplace else. So transition's key. You got to keep it fresh, because if you don't keep it fresh, deployments can get long and tedious, and worse off, boring. Yeah. So where were we going? Back to El Salvador. Another familiar spot. I've got 3 deployments under my belt, and I'm going to a place I've been to several times. I already know what the mission is. I'm excited. I am all about that counter-drug interdiction. I'm all about finding them fast boats and watching the action take place. It's interesting how it takes place, what things that we have to do on board the aircraft in order to locate, track, and deploying all the sensors that we need to deploy, and just things that I personally, in my job, don't get an opportunity to do. I go back there and I'll pick the brain of the sensor operators and the guys in the back who are into that. As I went out on those missions more and more, that's all you can do. It's either go back to the rack and go read a book or listen to music and then pass out, or get involved, find out what's going on. Make the flight better than what it is. And for me, that was kind of gaining knowledge of what those guys were doing back there. Did I retain any of it? No, but it kept me busy. Now, I ain't going to get into the time that we had off in between that deployment and the deployment to follow. So we'll just jump back into another deployment, which is kind of similar to the one that we had just done. But this time it was a little bit of everything. And the reason I bring this one up is because it will forever live in my memory as one of the hardest, just because I had been spoiled on my first tour with VP5, with all those different deployments, all those different countries that we went to, and all those opportunities to see all those cultures. And now it's just going back to kind of run over the same track and to do the same things that I had done already. But one thing comes to mind, right? go back to Okinawa and you're doing the same missions. And some of the things that I remember is a lot of the camaraderie, though. I think I enjoyed my time because I think we just had the right group of people in the right place together. And so my brothers and sisters in the Navy, they really make being on deployment a lot easier. And I think that's another thing that we don't think about. I've been talking about, hey, what was I doing? How did this affect me? And where was I going? But a lot of that is also your downtime, even when you're flying, if you have the right crew, that cohesiveness, the ability to mesh well with others, to work with them seamlessly. Those are things that I take with me too. And we just had a really great group of people during that time at that squadron. And, I cherish those moments, and I'm glad that I've had those experiences and made those friendships. But moving on, about a couple months into Okinawa, it's time to go again, back to El Salvador once again, because it was not necessarily a split deployment, but it was a tri-site. And I remember this vividly. I remember hearing it before we even went out on that second deployment of this tour. And it was like, hey, you know what? We're sending people to Djibouti. We're sending people to El Salvador. We're sending people to Okinawa. And Okinawa and El Salvador will be swapping crews, but Djibouti will have to stay there all 6 months. Yeah, and I remember thinking, please, God, don't let me go to Djibouti. So lucky for me, I was more of on a senior crew, and being senior has its privileges for sure. So lucky for us, we were actually going to go to Okinawa and trade off to El Salvador later on. And I was like, thank you, baby Jesus. So yeah, Okinawa. Same old there. Get to call El Salvador. Pumped once again, be going to do the counter drug interdiction mission, as always. If you can't tell already, that's definitely one of my favorites. So part of that experience, I was able to actually bring my wife down, and we actually spent, I think, 3 or 4 days together and saw a little bit of El Salvador that I even personally hadn't seen until then. But it was pretty cool. I was the only one that had a family come down to visit them. I think that was one of the greatest things about those kind of deployments. I mean, that was the first time I'd ever seen anything like that. But I think just considering where we were at, I don't think there was a risk like in most places. Like I ain't bringing my wife to the Middle East, but there are beautiful places that we would like to go to together, but I don't think that the military would have allowed that. I thought El Salvador, them allowing spouses to come and enjoy some free time and they give you a couple of days off. Come on, that's amazing. Gotta love it. That's over. I think it's a couple of days later. Everything seems to be going great. And I get a phone call from it's one of my supervisors. And he says, hey, listen, I'm going to have to send you to Djibouti because one of the guys out there needs a flight check. And the other guy that's supposed to be giving it, he's got to go home. He's got some personal things going on. And I need you to take his place. Man, not cool. But I did. And so I packed up and I went to the last place that I wanted to be during that time, which was Djibouti. But let me talk about the trip to get there because it was long. So first off, going through the airport in El Salvador, I wasn't thinking about this. And usually when you fly commercial from one place to another and you take your equipment, you make sure that you don't have any pyrotechnics or anything that's going to be considered a weapon. And so my air save vest, as they call it these days, for us old school guys, it was SV2. But anyway, it's your survival vest. And we got a lot of little nooks and crannies in it. We carried in a little flight bag with our helmet, among some other things. And so that was one of the things that I had packed but not checked, because I'm thinking in my brain, I fly with this thing every day. I take it on board the aircraft with me every day. It's not that big a deal. It's like breathing. And it really wasn't sinking in that I was about to get on a commercial airliner. Well, meanwhile, it's in this bag all nice and neatly folded up. And a couple of things didn't come out of it that should have come out of it. Now, I don't blame it on the PRs because, maybe I should have said something to them. I think just because it was last minute and I had to get out of there and get across the ocean quickly, I think we overlooked a few things. But my big ass K-bar was in there, which is like a 6-inch combat knife and with a serrated edge on one side. I mean, it looks like a Rambo knife, just a smaller version of it. And then the flares, I'm pretty sure I had the dual-sided flare, the one with smoke on one side and the flare on the other. I might have even had my little pencil flares, which they're all pyrotechnics. Every one of them is like a little explosive. And so that's a big no-no. But what's really weird about the whole thing is they confiscated my knife. They held me back for a minute. I didn't miss the flight or anything, but they didn't pull any of the pyrotechnics out. And I didn't even know about it until I got to the end of the flight, which was really weird because I took a flight to Dallas, Fort Worth, and I had to change over to a Lufthansa flight that was going to Munich. And then I flew from Munich to Ethiopia. And then from Ethiopia on this, I know you've seen some movies where there's chickens and farm animals on an airplane. It might have been Romancing the Stone or some weird old 80s movie like that. But let me tell you something, that shit happens. And so I was on this little, we'll call it like a 2-seater style airplane because there was only one seat on one side and one seat on the other side. And then there was it goes all the way to the back. You had 2 prop engines. And while I wasn't unfamiliar with a prop engine aircraft, I did not really like the way this one looked. It's one of those ones where you have to walk out to the tarmac and walk up a boarding ladder and get in. But like I said, there was chickens and shit on this one. Not to mention that, but before I even got on the airplane, I had a 2-hour layover there. I believe it's called Addis Abib in Ethiopia. That's the name of the airport. But I'm the only American walking around there. And even though, we're talking about 2010, I think it was, all of that is still pretty fresh. I mean, I know it's been 9 years since 9/11, but I mean, ISIS, Taliban, Al-Shabaab, all of those terror groups that are out there still to this day running around rampant. You're a soft target when you're traveling like that. So my biggest fear was somebody was going to grab me. Somebody was going to shoot me. I had a lot of things going through my head, especially when I'm walking around that airport. And you're talking, even my skin color was different than everybody. I'm looking around and I'm seeing people laying their carpets down and they are praying and they're doing, all the Islam stuff. And I don't know. I was lucky, I guess. Or the world just isn't as bad as we make it out to be. I'd like to think of the latter as the case, but you just never know. But think about that, right? So I'm coming from El Salvador and think of the stops. Think of the hours in the air. And I finally made it to Djibouti and I'm exhausted. And there's nobody there to pick me up. I don't think anybody knew that I was coming. I had to wait around for somebody. I mean, the sun was coming up by the time I got into my clue. So I wasn't super stoked about that, not to mention the fact that I'm coming back to a place that every night you wake up to take a piss. You have to walk out of your clue and you have to walk to another clue, which contains nothing but urinals and shitters. And so you got to get halfway decent in order to walk it, put some shoes on. And not to mention, if I had a mask of some sort, I'd be wearing that too, because like I said, they were still, the burn pits were going. They were burning trash and who knows, camel carcasses. We used to joke about it all the time. But it was the worst smell in all the world. And there was nothing you could do about it. It would come in through your air conditioning. And I can't even describe what the smell is. Let's just leave it at that. But that's what I was coming back to. So super pumped. In any case, I stayed there the requisite amount of time. I got the fellow flight engineer re-qualified and went about my business like you're supposed to do as any military member or first responder. And I just did what I had to do, regardless of how I felt about it. But now you know how I felt. So I came. Obama was in office. I think we had killed Osama bin Laden. SEAL teams got him. Yay. Yeah, I remember. I was still in Djibouti at the time, and I remember seeing the news and Obama talking about how they had found him and executed him for the most part. I mean, I don't know why they didn't bring him back and put his ass on trial and put him in jail. Whatever. Not my call. Anyway, everybody was glad that he was gone. Payback happened. We got our vengeance. It just didn't feel like I guess it was supposed to, because by then terrorism was the number one thing that everybody was dealing with as far as missions go. So it didn't help. So I get home in June, and I remember flying back, big old tin can full of whoop ass, as I think some of the memes have shown. So back with my family, life is good again. And I've already pretty much got orders. I know that I'm going in 6 months to Great Lakes to push boots, to put a red rope on, and to train recruits to turn civilians into sailors, as we say. So I was pretty excited about that. You know, I'm a first class petty officer at this time. So I'm an E6. I definitely have been up for promotion several times before this. I believe this was the 5th year that I had put a package in order to become a chief petty officer. Enlistment was coming up for myself. And so in August, I believe it was like the beginning of August 4th. I don't know why that date always pops up, but I do remember I reenlisted that day. I remember the skipper came down. He was the one that reenlisted me. Great guy. In fact, his last name was Fox, John Fox. He was a commander, John Fox, at the time, and the commanding officer of VP5. So pretty cool all the way around. So he reenlisted me that day. And then, and we're talking about, this is 2011. So just so we got the timeline right. And then like a couple of hours later, like we all knew the results were going to be out, but at this point I was so desensitized that I didn't think I was ever going to make it. And I was like, okay, if it happens, it happens. But there's still always that anticipation. But I got lost in doing other things. By this time, I was working in maintenance control. I had my safe reflect qualification. I was able to operate the whole maintenance department on my own. I was one of the few E6s that were doing that at the time. So it was pretty prestigious. I was pretty proud of myself. But I got the call. The skipper came back downstairs and he said, "Do you think you're special?" Actually, he was cursing. He says, what the fuck, Garcia? Do you think today is your day? You're gonna re-enlist and make chief all at the same time? And so that was a really cool way to find out that I'd been selected. He came down and congratulated me and the CMC and everybody else who was down there, and which was a lot of people. So when you get information like that, to me, it's one of those moments that will stay with you a lifetime. Obviously, if I can explain it or if I can describe it in great detail like I just did, it does mean a lot to me. It did mean a lot to me, and it will always mean a lot to me in that case. But what means more to me is that feeling of wanting to share that with the person that means the most to you. So, you know, if you've never served, it's hard to explain what making chief means, and having that trust put into you that your peers feel that you are worthy to step into those shoes, to step into becoming a leader, or a better leader in this case, to having more responsibility. And you know, it's not about rank, and it's not about the expectation. You know, it's about serving others. It's about taking care of your people. And one of the things that I used to mentor young chiefs coming up after I had already made chief was, and I learned this myself as well from all my mentors, is that we don't take care of sailors. We help sailors take care of themselves. We give them the leadership and the resources in order to be able to do that successfully. So, you take care of your children. That's a different idea, right? Kind of the same concept, but you do it in different ways, right? Those kids, those guys and gals that you're leading, they got to go home and take care of themselves at the end of the day. You're not there to do that. And a lot of times what I used to say is you can lead them to the door. You can even open the door in some cases for them, but you could never walk them through it. They have to walk through it themselves. And so that's how I equate, taking care of people coming up in the world, taking care of your people, standing up for them when they can't stand up for themselves, and backing them and supporting them in ways that make sense, if it makes sense. Because I always told them, I always tell my people, I'm not going to stand up for you if it doesn't make sense. You got to be doing the right thing, and then I'll definitely support you 100%. So when I talk about moments like that one, and I think about people that I want to share it with, I think about my wife, which is the first person that I called, of course, when I got told that I got selected. So yes. And then the thanks begin to every single person that you feel that made an impact in your life that got you where you are in order to be selected. And there was quite a list. And I don't even think I was able to think them all. Maybe I did. I hope I did. But if I missed you, I'm thanking you now. So from that moving on, it's game on, right? So the time-honored tradition of Chiefs initiation, Chiefs indoctrination, Chiefs induction, they've changed the name so many times to be politically correct. I don't even think they know what to call it anymore. But I will say that I think I was on the trailing end of when things started to change, where people were like, God, I can't believe how watered down it has become. And so at the time, you think, man, that's horrible. You don't want to hear that, right? And you don't want to experience something less than one of your brothers and sisters experience, because that just kind of takes away from it. And so we used to hear that all the time, especially from them salty old Master Chiefs. So I know things were different. Things are always going to evolve and become different. I don't want, and I didn't want to get less training or a worse kind of training because of that. And I don't feel like we did. I feel like you perceive whatever training and whatever experience you're getting just based on where you're at the time, just like with anything that you experience, where you're at in your head. There was a lot going on. They teach you how to prioritize and manage your time wisely in order to be able to not only be part of the tradition that will last, between 6 to 8 weeks, depending on the time frame, to get the most out of it, to have that camaraderie with the people that you're coming up with, and to learn all the things that you need to learn to be a better leader and to be able to use that later on when you pin those anchors on. So there was a lot of focus on growth. I'm sure we learned a lot of traditions, stuff that I would never give away because I think that it's sacred. It is sacred. I think everybody's got to experience it in their own way. What I will say is that if you're not coming out there with an ounce of humility, then you did it wrong. But humility is like one of the number one things that they teach you. They teach you can't do it on your own. You've got resources in the mess and your fellow chief petty officers to help you out that are there for you globally, because it's one of the most well-known and the best fraternities out there, if you want to say. But you never stop learning. And I even learned that coming out of military life into the civilian world in an organization that has adopted principles like that. And one of them is lifelong learning, right? So you're always learning something new. You are never going to know all there is to know. And so that's another thing that they teach you when you're being mentored, that you're not going to have all the answers, but a culmination of everybody together may have the answer you're looking for. So I got pinned on September 16th of 2011, a date that for me will live in infamy. That was an amazing thing. The 24 hours prior, right? So final night, they call it. An amazing experience, one that I won't soon forget, and one that I was able to actually be a part of there on after, which is also a great experience in itself. So 1 minute, you're a first-class petty officer. You're still leading people, but not at a very high level. You're doing some minor things, but you're not necessarily plug and play. They're like, hey, this is where you need to be. These are the people you need to be there for. Lead them, make sure things get done. And usually being told that by a chief. And then now, put the anchors on. People are expecting something different. They're expecting a more dynamic role, something that you can fit into easily and move in and out of certain areas in order to be able to lead people no matter where you're at, to be able to take up the mantle of somebody else and take something across the finish line that you hadn't even started. So kind of like those missions I was talking about in the last episode, it's tough when you do, like 90% of the work and then you got to hand it off and let somebody finish it up for you. That's part of that teamwork. And that's part of understanding that you can't do everything all by yourself. And so another hard lesson to learn, but one that has taken me as far as I am today and one that I'm grateful to have learned. The real work begins, as they say. Now you're a chief petty officer. Now you're doing these things. You're going to get an opportunity to see all these things that we've kind of put scenarios on you that you're going to be able to experience yourself and kind of get that under your belt. And you won't get as much ribbing from the chiefs that have been around for a while because, of course, you put the uniform on and everybody talks about how you still smell like the Navy Exchange. You smell like a new uniform and you're a boot chief. Well, that doesn't last very long, especially when you're kind of thrown into the fire of making sure that you've got people that you're doing right by and your leadership is really taking them further than they would have ever gone before. I wouldn't really get an opportunity to do that, at least not on the fleet level. I definitely was about to go lead quite a few sailors in the world, but they were so new in their careers, they would have followed me to the edge of the earth if the earth was flat and then jumped off with me. So, and that would be in Great Lakes. And that's where I got orders to go starting in January of 2012. So I would be going there to become a recruit division commander. Another one of those things where you have to get qualified to do before you can actually do it. So like anything, the Navy is going to put you into situations and scenarios to show off your skills to be able to do that. And once they feel that you are competent in doing so and they're confident in putting you out there, then you're going to get an opportunity to turn civilians into sailors. And so that's where I was headed. Sometimes people ask me what the best years of my career were. Honestly, I don't know if I could pick just one. But when I look back, those 6 years shaped almost everything that came after. I saw places I'd never thought I'd see again. I worked beside incredible people. I learned how to teach. I learned how to lead. And somewhere between deployment number 5 and pinning on Chief's anchors, I stopped measuring success by the places I'd been. I started measuring it by the people that I could help. That realization would prepare me for the next chapter of my career because next time we're headed to Great Lakes, Illinois, where I learned that leading classrooms is one thing, but leading 88 recruits through boot camp is something entirely different. If this episode brought back memories, taught you something new, or reminded you of someone who served, I'd appreciate it if you share it with them. If you're enjoying the podcast, be sure to follow on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe, leave a comment, and let me know what part of today's story resonated with you. I read every comment, and many of them inspire future episodes. And if you're so willing, you can also find me and some great things at notabystander.com, where every purchase helps support the first responder community and the mission behind this podcast. Until next time, I'm Chris Garcia. Take care of each other. Never stop serving those around you. And remember, be all in, always.